Good morning, or wherever you are. This morning's class is actually being brought to you from the old country. I am in Flatbush, Brooklyn. That's the old country. Kind of like if it were last week's Parsha, then I could refer to it as Artzecha Moladetecha Ubeis Avicha. But interestingly enough, something very similar to that is actually in this week's Parasha. Just as when God nominally first spoke to Abraham, he gave him a three-part instruction, Artzecha, Moladetecha, Beit Avicha, with arguably increasing intensity. Right? It's easier to simply leave one's motherland, more difficult to leave one's ancestral homeland, and most difficult of all to part company with family. So one can make the same argument at the end of this coming week's Sidra when God says, Bincha yichidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak. Right, that, as Abraham, at least according to the Midrash, said, Bincha, I got more than one, right? Asher ahavta, I love them both. So again, I'm in the yeshiva of Flatbush in Brooklyn, and so far the connectivity is fine. For all I know, the connectivity from Brooklyn is even greater than that from the Upper West Side. Certainly, it has greater connectivity to the land of Israel than the Upper West Side, and therefore, I suppose it is implicitly closer to heaven. So here we go. I do want to talk about the Akedah, and of course, what we're going to focus on is a Piyutanic approach to the Akedah. So let me enlarge this a little, no reason not to. I start off with a cartoon that I came across. I don't remember when or where. We have two characters in it, of course. We have Abraham on the left and Isaac on the right. I don't think it's significant that neither of them seems to be having their heads covered. I assume that's because they both subscribe to the German Jewish tradition in which kippot are required only for ritual things. This is essentially a play on the exchange between Abraham and Yitzchak as they approach Har HaMoriah, where Yitzchak says to his father, Hinei ha'etz v'ha'etzim v'ayeh hasela olah. Meaning he seems to be saying that if we have wood and we have a flame, a fire, then obviously we're going to, we're not going to roast marshmallows. So obviously the function of the Eish and the Eitzim is to prepare for a sacrifice. So he basically says to his father, but where's the sacrifice? We haven't brought one. Okay, again, right? Here's the wood for the sacrifice. Here's the dagger for the sacrifice. And that's an interesting thing is to point out. The truth of the matter is that this isn't true to the biblical text. In the biblical text, Yitzchak says, Ayeh ha'esh v'ha'etzim. He doesn't mention the ma'achelet. And an explanation for why he doesn't mention the ma'achelet is that according to at least one major approach to the Akedah, the non-midrashic approach, Isaac at the Akedah was not 37 years old, as the Midrash would have him, but rather was closer to being 13 years old. And the function of the Akedah was to initiate Yitzchak into the ritual of sacrifice, right? To prepare him, to show him how to offer a korban to God. And therefore, at the age of 12 or 13, he finds the ma'achelet so frightening that he just simply ignores it. Right? If he doesn't mention it, maybe it isn't really there. In any event, what does Abraham ask? And then the lower panel on the left, so he says, "Vayeh hasela olah." Where is the sacrifice? So Abraham, if you recall, says, "Elohim yir'eh lo hasela olah b'ni." Right? God will provide the object of the sacrifice, my son. Okay, so watch. Where's the sacrifice? God will provide Isaac. Elohim yirelo hasela ola b'ni. Right? And what does Yitzchak say? He says, wait, did you say God will provide comma Isaac? Meaning Elohim yirelo hasela ola b'ni? Or did you say God will provide Isaac? Elohim yirelo hasela ola b'ni? Implying that Yitzchak was to be the sela ola. So Avraham in the last panel on the bottom says, come here, son. And Yitzchak says, I ain't budging until you put in a comma. Meaning he wants to be sure that his father has not said that he, Yitzchak, will be the Sela Olah, but rather that God will choose the Sela Olah. Okay, that basically is the crux. I mean, cartoons, if they're good, and this is a really good cartoon, manage to capture in very few words and in very explicit images the essence, the crux of a very significant issue or problem. And this cartoon successfully does it because the crux here is whether God ever intended for Isaac to actually be sacrificed. And even if you want to say that, no, God never really intended it, he only wanted Abraham to think that that was the objective, that still raises a considerable question. Is it fair, equitable, ethical, moral of God to put Abraham in the position where it nominally for the 3 days that he's traveling with Yitzchak to Eretz HaMoriah, he keeps thinking that this is the last that he's going to see of Yitzchak. So whether indeed the Sela Olah was B'ni, or whether the Sela Olah was something apart from B'ni, is, as I said, the crux of the whole story of the Akedah, and we'll get to it in due time. I just simply here, I'm not going to go through this, just simply shared with you in case you are interested, some of the principal features in the analysis of the Akedah story. Okay, so here we have piyutim that are devoted to the Akedah, and they appear primarily in the liturgy, not just of Rosh Hashanah and the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, but they appear prominently throughout the month of Elul for Sephardim, and at least for the last week or so of Elul for Ashkenazim in the daily Slichot. Okay, if you are familiar with the Slichot ritual, towards the very end of the Slichot, there is always a Piyut which is considered important enough that the Aron Kodesh is open for its recitation. Okay, if you find those piyutim in your Slichot book and you turn back a page, you'll find that invariably the last Slicha to be recited before the one for which the Aron Kodesh is opened is invariably a Slicha for the Akedah. So Slichot for the Akedah, as it says, appear primarily in the Rosh Hashanah liturgy, where the binding of Yitzchak, Akedat Yitzchak, is a central theme, both as a Torah reading and as a symbol of self-sacrifice and divine mercy. We'll get there. These Akedah Piyutim are typically inserted into the Musaf Amidah, that's different tradition, especially within the section of Zichronot, appealing to God to recall the merit of Abraham and Yitzchak's obedience. Okay. The details here are finer than we really need to appreciate the piyut that we're going to look at today, and it's all here. Again, if you have the interest in it, you can look it up yourselves. I want to just go to the last item here, item number 5, representative examples. And as I said, there are scores of Akedah Piyutim, but amongst the scores of Akedah Piyutim, there are several which, by virtue of their incorporation into the Slichot or the Amim HaNoraim rituals of either Ashkenazic or various non-Ashkenazic Jewries, have basically won themselves a greater reputation than the run-of-the-mill Akedah Piyutim. So the representative examples, at least according to whoever compiled this list, includes Eight Sha'arei Ratzon, written by Yehuda ibn Abbas in the 12th century in Spain, and it is regarded by some as the best-known example of a piyut for the Akedah. It dramatizes Abraham's trial, the Nisayon of Abraham, Sarah's anguish, right? Again, this is midrashic, and concludes with an appeal to God for mercy. We're going to look at this piyut. There are also an Akedat Yitzchak Bayanai, who, if you may recall, was one of the earliest, and according to some, even the earliest of the Paitanim, living in the land of Israel as early perhaps as the 6th century. And there's a piyut that's more familiar to Ashkenazim because it is inserted into the liturgy on Yom Kippurim. It's called Ela Ezkara, which, although it is principally about the Asara Hurugei Malchut, the 10 martyrs, it deliberately parallels the Akedah motif, portraying martyrdom as a national repetition of Akedat Yitzchak. Akedat Yitzchak on a national scale. Okay. So, this is the piyut referred to previously, composed in the 12th century in Spain by Yehuda ibn Abbas. And the title of the piyut comes from the refrain at the end of every stanza, and it is Oked v'hane'ekad v'hamizbeach. Okay, Oked, an active participle, the one who did the binding. Ne'ekad, in the reflexive of the verb, the one who was bound, and the mizbeach, the altar upon which the bound Yitzchak was placed by the Oked Avraham. Okay, it's not a difficult piyut linguistically, but it is nonetheless complicated if we try to identify all of the biblical and midrashic allusions that it incorporates, as we've seen in previous piyutim. So it begins, Et sha'arei ratzon lehi pateach. I suppose that reciting a piyut by Ibn Abbas in Flatbush, given the predominance in Flatbush these days of Jews of Syrian ancestry, probably somewheres in the metaphysical world, someone is rejoicing. So, at the moment in time when the gates of compassion, ratzon being God's will expressed in his compassion for the Jewish people, lihi pateach, are being opened. Yom eheyeh chapai le'el shoteach, the day on which we spread our hands out in prayer to God. Ana, we say to God, please, zechor nali biyom hocheach, on this day in which of tochecha, this day of rebuke, of remonstration, okay, may God remember on my account, Oked v'hane'ekad v'hamizbeach, in essence, Akedat Yitzchak. Bi'acharit, at the end, towards the end of what we'll see, Nusa b'sof ha'asara. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avot tells us that Avraham Avinu was tested 10 times. He underwent 10 tests, of which arguably Lech Lecha was the first, and V'halehu Shamla Ola was the last or final one. So, in this final test, the last of the 10 tests that Abraham underwent, Haben Asher Nolad Lecha Misara, the child Yitzchak, who was born to Sarah, Im Nafshecha Vo Ad Ma'od Nikshara, despite the fact that Abraham had established this bond with Isaac, Kum, arise, Ha'alehu Lila Ola Vara, offer him to me as a pure sacrifice. Where? Al Har Asher Kavod Lecha Zoreach, on a mountain in which there is some sort of heavenly glow. Now, what is that a reference to? It's clearly a reference to Har Moriah. But why would he refer to Har Moriah as a mountain that has a heavenly glow? Now, of course, if indeed Har Moriah is the mountain on which the Akedah took place, and if indeed it was the mountain upon which subsequently the Batei Mikdash were built, then I understand that it has some sort of aura to it. It may not really be a visible aura, but I can understand where somebody may say that there's an aura that attaches to it. But in this case, it may be something more than that. When God gives instructions to Avraham, he says that the place in which the Olah will be offered is al achad heharim asher omare lecha, on top a mountain that I will, designate, or that I will, direct you to. Okay. Then it says, Bayom HaShlishi, on the third day, Vayisa Avram et Einav, Abraham looks up, Vayar et hamakom merachok, and at a distance he saw the place. Doesn't tell us that anywhere on that 3-day journey that God subsequently appeared to him and told him which mountain it would be. So how did Avraham know which mountain it was if God hadn't told him? So of course there are two answers to the question, the Pshat answer and the Drash answer. The Pshat answer is that even though the Torah doesn't tell us, sometime during the 3-day journey, clearly God appeared to Avraham and gave him additional instructions. Okay. The Midrashic answer is that Avraham could recognize the mountain because it had a visible aura. And that seems to be what the Paitan, what Ibn Abbas is alluding to here in the line Asher al kavod lecha zoreach, that you can identify the mountain from its heavenly aura. Now, here we go first of all, in the next stanza, into one of the several things here for which there is really no source in the biblical text itself. Amar l'Sarah. Okay. Sarah is not mentioned anywhere in the chapter of the Akedah. There is no reference to her. The next thing that we hear about Sarah is Vayiyu chayei Sarah vatamot Sarah, that she dies at some subsequent point in time. So the idea that somehow Sarah is aware of the Akedah, let alone being informed about the Akedah, is a midrashic invention. Okay. Amar Sarah, Abraham, as it were, said to Sarah, Ki chamudech Yitzchak, your darling Yitzchak, Gadel, right? He's grown up, v'lo lamad avodat shachak, and he hasn't yet learned how to serve God. Shachak is a poetic name for heaven. So he hasn't learned how to serve God. Elech va'orehu asher lo elchak. Let me go and let me instruct him in the ways of God. Amra, to which he said, L'cha adon, by all means. Aval al tirchak, don't go too far. Okay. Anna, Abraham replied, Yilibech be'el boteach. What are you worried about? Oked v'ne'ekad v'hamizbeach. Shachar v'hishkim la'aloch baboker. You may recall, the Torah says, Vayashkem Avraham baboker. Right? That not only did he fulfill these instructions, but he began to fulfill them at the earliest possible moment. Right? The Talmud tells us, Zrizim makdimim lemitzvot, that there's a certain category of people, earnest people, who seize the earliest opportunity to do a mitzvah. So again, Shachar, right? Dawn broke. V'hishkim, Avraham got up extra early. Lahaloch baboker, to get an early start. Ushnei na'arav mimetei hasheker, taking along, accompanied by 2 servants. But let us think that these are servants who are already sharing Avraham's faith in God. The Paitan reminds us that they were from the people of Sheker, right? That they were not people who followed Avraham's path. And Midrash tells us that they were Yishmael and Eliezer. Yom HaShlishi, on the 3rd day of their march, Naga'u el Cheker, they arrived at the place for which they were looking. Vayar demut kavod v'hod vayeker. And again, somehow they sensed or they saw some kind of an aura. Amad v'hitbonan lehimasheach. So Abraham then paused and he contemplated his next steps. Oked v'hane'ekad v'hamizbeach. Yadu'una arav kikra'am lemor. So the two servants who accompanied Abraham were instructed, or Hari'item tzatz barosh har hamor. Abraham said to them, did you see sun rise above this particular mountain? Vayomru, to which they responded, Lo nechzeh rak mahamor. We don't see it. Meaning, the fact that they are called mitei sheker, that they are called the people of who are still walking a false path, right, was on display by virtue of the fact that while Abraham could see the aura surrounding the mountain, they were unable to see it. Therefore, Anah, he said to them, Shvupo am mishulim lachamor. Of course, the Torah text says, Shvupo im hachamor, but if you change the chirik under the ayin of im to a patach, then you get am. So that's the midrashic reading, Shvu lachem am hachamor, meaning the two of you are like donkeys, meaning that if you can't see the aura, you don't deserve to go any further. Vani v'anar lehishtateach, and I will go along with Yitzchak and do our bowing, our obeisance to God. Oked v'hane'ekad v'hamizbeach. Halchu shnehem la'asot bimlacha. So the two of them went to do whatever it was that they were supposed to do. Vayane Yitzchak la'aviv kacha. And at some point, Isaac says as follows, and we go back to the cartoon at the beginning. Avi, re'eh, eish, va'atzei ma'aracha. So I see that we brought a fire and we brought firewood. Aye Adoni se asher kahalacha. But where is the sacrificial animal? If you wish, where is the guest of honor? Okay. Ha'at biyom zeh datcha shocheach. He's saying, did you forget to bring him along? Oked v'hane'ekad v'hamizbeach. So Abraham, the father, answered with a kind of divine inspiration, or presuming to speak on behalf of God, Kihu asher yir'eh la'olah haseh, that his instructions were that God will. Now, remember that in biblical Hebrew, lir'ot almost all of the time means the sense of sight. It means to see. But occasionally it is used idiomatically to mean to choose. Right? Remember, at the end of the story, Abraham names the place, the site of the Akedah, Hashem Yireh, which doesn't mean God will see, it means God will choose. Asher Ye'amer Hayom, Bahar Hashem Yireh. Where does God appear? Where is God's presence felt most strongly? Right? On this mountain. So again, lir'ot here is being used in the idiomatic sense of looking at somebody as a choice, as a matter of choice. Okay? So, kihu asher yir'eh la'olah haseh, God will choose the sacrificial animal. Da, kol asher yachpotz Elohim ya'aseh. After all, we're all subject to God's omniscience, to God's omnipotence. Nivneveni hayom lefanav kisei. The kisei here, of course, is just simply a way of expressing the mizbeach, right? Let's go and let's build the altar. As, right? Once the altar is built, ya'amir zevach v'hazoveach, then the question of who is making the offering and who is being offered will clarify itself. Oked v'hane'ekad v'hamizbeach. By the way, since this is the first thing that's highlighted in blue rather than in yellow, I was trying to distinguish between things in yellow that could be trying to distinguish between things that could be derived exegetically from the text, as opposed to things in blue that it's difficult to see how they are derived exegetically from the text. They seem to present themselves rather as midrashic additions. Okay. Dafaku b'sha'arei rachamim liftoach. Somebody went knocking upon the gates of compassion, calling upon them to open. Who called upon them? Haben, Yitzchak, Lihizaveach, because he saw himself being designated as the object of the sacrifice. V'av, and Avraham, he would knock on the doors of compassion. Lizboach, because he felt that he was put into a situation where he would have to sacrifice his son. Kovim, while the two of them are hoping, La'el, right, praying to God as it were, Uvrachamav livtoach, and throwing themselves upon God's mercy. And here's a citation of a biblical verse from the book of Yeshayahu, B'koyeh Hashem yachalifu koach. The people who put their trust in God will get a second wind, so to speak. A second chance, a second wind. Darshu benachalat elihis tapeach. At that moment in time, at least, they thought that Isaac was going to die, that he would somehow go up to heaven. That's nachalat el. I mean, to heaven, listapech, that he would somehow be added to the heavenly cohorts. Oked v'hane'ekad v'hamizbeach. Hechin atzei olah be'on v'chayil. So Avraham energetically goes about, right, and arranging the firewood. Vayakod Yitzchak ka'okdo ayil, and he bound up Yitzchak in the same manner as he would have bound up a ram. Vayihi ma'or yomam be'enam layil. And although it was early in the morning, right, because of what they were going to do, everything was dark for them, dark in the sense of sorrowful. V'hamon dema'av nozulim b'chayil. And surely, at this moment in time, they must have been crying bitterly. Ayin b'mar bocha v'lev sameach. A bitter-sweet moment, right? Bitter because Abraham still imagines that he's parting from Yitzchak. Yitzchak still imagines that he is going to be killed. But lev sameach because they're doing this in fulfillment of God's will. Oked v'hane'ekad v'hamizbeach. And now Yitzchak speaks. Sichu le'imi, tell my mother, ki sisona pana, that her joy, her pride and joy, is gone. Haben asher yalada letish'im shana, the child who was born when she was 90 years old, hayala eish, right? He went up in flames, ulama'achelet mana, and was severed into pieces. Ana, avakesh la minachem ana. Is there any source of consolation for her? Tsar li la'em tivkevet tityapeach. I am distressed over the fact that my mother is going to cry bitterly over me. Oked v'hane'ekad v'hamizbeach. Mima'achelet yehemeh midbari. I see the slaughter knife, right, coming towards me. Nachadeda avi, says to his father, make sure that it is sharp. Ve'et ma'asari chazek, and make sure that I am bound tightly, right? Why? Because there are laws of shchita, okay? It has to be done properly, right? So the knife has to be flawless, it has to be sharpened, and the sacrificial victim has to be bound tightly so it doesn't move. Ve'et yakad yukod bivsarit, and when you light the fire, kachimcha hanishar me'afari, be sure to collect my ashes. Ve'emor l'sara, and take them home and tell my mother, ze li Yitzchak re'ach, this is what remains of Isaac. Oked v'hane'ekad v'hamizbeach. Vayehemu kol malachei merkava, and all the angels in heaven were now stirred up. Ofan v'saraf shoalim bin dava, and they're questioning. Mitchanenim la'el ba'ad sar tzava, and they're praying to God on behalf of one of his officers. Ana, please, t'nafid yom v'chofer hava. Let's find another way out of this situation. Al na yehi olam b'li yareach. How can the world survive without a moon? I mean, if Abraham was the sun, right, then again, metaphorically speaking, Yitzchak was the moon. Okay. oked v'ne'ekad v'hamizbeach. Amar li Avram Adon Shamayim, whereupon God, right, Deus ex machina, God says to Abraham, Al tishlacha yad el shlish urayim. Do not raise your hand against, shalish is an officer, again in the hierarchy of things, okay? Shuvu l'shalom malachei machanayim. You can go back home peacefully. Yom zeh zechut livnei Yerushalayim. But this day on which you, at least, exhibited this willingness to fulfill what you thought was my will, okay, will be a merit for the Jewish people, B'nai Yerushalayim. Bo sha'arei rachamim ani poteach, the day on which the gates of compassion are open, namely the Aseret Yomei Teshuvah, right? Then God, as we know, will recall this in their favor. Oked v'ne'ekad v'hamizbeach. Livritcha shochein zevul u'shavua, calling upon God, right, the dweller upon high, who has taken an oath to the Jewish people. Zochra, we're asking upon you to recall this oath, le'edah so'ara negu'ah, on behalf of this people of Israel who are tempest-tossed, ushmat ki'ah, tok'ah, utru'ah, and in the sounding of the shofar, kisharosh, I'm sorry, again, this is, I should have edited this better, this insertion, obviously, on if Rosh Hashanah fell on Shabbat, then there would be no Tekiyah. Then for the line that says, hear the Kiyat Shofar, there's a substitution, Shema Tfilah Zochra L'Truah. Listen to the prayer which replaces the blowing of the Shofar. Ve'emor L'Tzion, and when you hear the blast of the Shofar, tell the Jewish people, Bazman HaYeshuah, that the time of your redemption has come. Yinon ve'Eliyah, Yinon is a poetic name for the Mashiach, and Eliyahu, the harbinger of the Mashiach, Ani Sholech, is on his way. Oked v'ne'ekad v'hamizbeach. As I said, it's a beautiful piyut. It isn't really that difficult linguistically, but as I said, there are numerous allusions here, both to biblical texts, as well as to midrashic accretions to the biblical text. And you have accessible to you all of these scholarly notes that were prepared by the editor of this text. Okay.
Professor Sokolow, can I ask a question quickly?
Depends. If it's a short answer, I'll answer it shortly, yes.
So based on this piyut, do you ever, he bases it on the Midrash, but does the Paytan ever add his own levels of Midrash, imagines what Sarah, like Beni,
In other piyutim, yes.
Yes, okay.
Indeed. So I just want to show you, if you recall on the first page, it listed 3 exceptional Akedah piyutim. The first is the one we read, the Eight Sha'arei Ratzon Lehi Pateach. The second was from Yanai, arguably the first, the oldest of the Paitanim. So here is just a small excerpt from Yanai's Akedat Yitzchak, for which I was able to find online a poetic English translation of it. Okay, Avraham, okay, Nisna. Now, obviously, Nisna is an artificial grammatical form. Okay, it's like trying to take the verb linasot, to test, and to make it into a nif'al, into a reflexive, was tested. So instead of nusa, the pu'al, which is the usual way to make it passive, right? He puts it into the nif'al, makes it nisna. Now, this is one of the features, I've mentioned this before, and we'll look at it a little more in greater detail as we go along. One of the things that evoked Ibn Ezra's ire against Paitanim, the fact that they manufactured words. So this is an excellent example of a manufactured word. Those of you who know Yiddish, it's called ungepatchked. Okay? Avraham nisna, Abraham was tested, l'shemu l'tiferet, for the purpose of enhancing his reputation. Okay? Nitbachen. There's another, this is one, it's easier to break this down, but it's another non-existent grammatical form, right? It would be the hitpa'el of livchon, to test, right? Nitbachen, he was tested or tried, basara nisyonot, 10 times, B'chulam nimtza ne'eman, and he passed all the tests. He got an A. Uva acharon, the final test, the akedah, nitztava al b'no yechido. He was instructed to do something with his only son. Ab chamal, he was compassionate towards his son. Uvein nit'ana, right? And yet Yitzchak submitted, he gave in. Okay. Zochrana lanu hayom brit avicha. Okay, so he's invoking the covenant that God made with Avraham, uvzichron ha'akedah, and on account of the akedah, ye'aked Yitzchak lefanecha lechaper aleinu. Imagine, as it were, he says that Yitzchak was bound up. Imagine that Yitzchak represents the Jewish people. Okay, so just as you instructed Avraham not to do any harm to Yitzchak, we're calling upon you, in memory of this, or resonating with this, not to cause any harm to the Jewish people. So again, you can see this is a theme that's struck in both of these instances. Now, in both cases, as I said, going back to the original biblical text, the one that says "V'halehu sham la'olah," okay. The question is, as I said, was it ever God's intention that Yitzchak should be slaughtered? No. How can I say no with such definition? Because we know that the Torah's position is entirely contrary to the notion of child sacrifice. The Torah, on almost half a dozen instances, reminds the Jewish people that when they enter the land of Canaan, they're going to encounter civilizations that have different rites and practices, and that one of the rites and practices of the Canaanite civilization was child sacrifice, and that they should be exceptionally wary of it. There's even a recorded instance in Nevi'im Rishonim of a battle that the Israelites waged against the people of Moab, and the king of Moab is said to have sacrificed his own child in a plea to his God to assist the Moabites. And it says that the reaction of the children of Israel was they actually abandoned the field of battle. They were so revolted at the sight that they just simply couldn't continue the battle. Okay. So since we know that the Torah's position is so forthrightly and adamantly opposed to child sacrifice, it is inconceivable that God ever intended Yitzchak to be sacrificed. Okay. So if it was never God's intention that Isaac be sacrificed, then what was the test? So the conventional answer is that the test was that Avraham was supposed to imagine that that was God's intention, and God wanted to see how far would Avraham go in fulfilling what he erroneously thought was God's intention. Okay. I have trouble with that too, because as I said in the introduction, can't imagine that God was content with the fact that for the 3 days that they were traveling, that Abraham every moment of the time thought that this was the last moment that he would share with Yitzchak. That God would subject Abraham to such emotional pain, it just simply, there's got to be a better explanation to it, a better interpretation of it. So long ago, when I first started teaching Tanakh, I took advantage of a reference in the commentary of Ibn Ezra to the view of the Akedah that was taken by Saadia Gaon. Saadia Gaon's commentary on the Torah in those days had not yet been published. It has since been published. But Ibn Ezra tells us enough about it that I was able to put the pieces together. Saadia Gaon, instead of deriving the word nisa from the verb to test, derived the word nisa from the same verbal root that gives us the word nes. Now, the biblical word nes does not mean a miracle. Right? The biblical word nes means a standard, an emblem, okay? A sign or an emblem. And he says that Elohim nisa et Avraham doesn't mean that God tested Avraham, because philosophically speaking, tests are only administered to determine, ascertain something not previously known. And to say that God didn't know how Avraham would act is not inconsistent with God's omniscience. Therefore, he interpreted Elohim Nisayet Avraham, that God elevated Avraham. How did he elevate him? Basically, by having him put on this act. That by publicly making a public demonstration of Avraham's belief and trust in God, it was a way of elevating Avraham for the purpose of demonstrating to his contemporaries, right, why it was that God favored him, so that ultimately, when God would give the land to Avraham's descendants, people wouldn't be able to say, what do they have to do with it? Why do they deserve it? They would understand that they deserve it because they were descendants of Avraham, who was this faithful to God. Okay. But even that was problematic. It was problematic for two reasons. A simple reason, because it takes place with nobody watching. So how do you say that it was, a demonstration of Abraham's belief in God when even the two people who accompanied him, right, who arguably would have publicized it, weren't even present when it happened? Okay. So I came up with another idea. The other idea that I came up with was by way of a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. There's a Mishnah late in Pirkei Avot that says, Asara dvarim nivra'u be'erev Shabbat bein hashmashot. That there were arguably 10 things that were the last things to be created at the last moment on the Friday of creation, the last moment in which God did something active before retreating into Shabbat. He created 10 things. And according to at least one opinion, one of the 10 things was Elo Shel Avraham, the ayil, the ram that gets sacrificed in lieu of Isaac. Now, I don't really believe that means that the ram was 2,000 years old when Avraham slaughtered it. Okay? Because, first of all, rams don't live that long. Okay? And the second thing is because I don't know how long it can hold its breath, but I don't know how it would have survived the flood. Okay? So let's just assume that what that means to tell us is not that the ram itself was 2,000 years old, but that the ram as the denouement of the Akedah, as the conclusion, the punchline of the Akedah, was what God intended all along. Okay, meaning God intended all along, as we saw in the poem of Ibn Abbas, Avraham was supposed to go up the mountain with Yitzchak in order to initiate Yitzchak into the proper way in which to offer korbanot, the right place in which to offer a korban, and the correct manner in which to offer a korban. Okay, that was the purpose of their outing from the beginning. And the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot is basically telling us that the ayil was there waiting for them. So then, of course, the question is, so why didn't Avraham sacrifice the ayil? If indeed I'm correct, and it was intention all along not to sacrifice Isaac, but to simply instruct Isaac in the preparation of the sacrifice, and if indeed the animal, the ayil, was there, not for 2,000 years, but was there waiting for him to be offered as a sacrifice, then why didn't he do it? So the answer comes from the fact that the Torah tells us that when Avraham saw the ayil was ne'echaz basvach bekarnav. It was entangled in a thicket on the mountain, but it says achar hasvach. And arguably, achar hasvach means on the far side of the thicket, meaning the ayil, which was intended to be the object of the sacrifice all along, was there and waiting for Avraham and Yitzchak. But at a critical moment, Avraham failed to see it. When Yitzchak said, Ayeh hasela olah, Avraham should have been able to point and to say, don't you see it? It's right up there. But he couldn't see it because the ayil failed to come around to his side of the mountain because it had gotten stuck in the thicket. Therefore, what happens at this critical moment? At this critical moment, what does Avraham do? He says, I came here with Yitzchak to show him how to offer a korban, and I understood implicitly from God's instructions that there would be something here for me to sacrifice. I don't see it. So I'm going to go over my instructions. God said, Kach na'et bincha et yidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak. Here he is. Here I am. Here's Yitzchak. Lech lecha l'Eretz HaMoriah. Big sign hanging there saying, welcome to Eretz HaMoriah. Okay? What are the next words? V'ha'alehu sham la'olah. Says Avraham, up until now, I assume the ha'alehu sham la'olah. Ha'alehu means take him up because we're going to a mountain. Right? We're going up on a mountain. Ha'alehu, ascend the mountain with Yitzchak, la'olah, for the purpose of offering a korban. But now that I don't see an animal to sacrifice, maybe I misunderstood v'ha'alehu. Maybe ha'alehu didn't mean take him up the mountain. Maybe ha'alehu meant offer him as the sacrifice. Whereupon Avraham seizes Yitzchak, right, and is about to do, and all of a sudden God says, whoa, he says, that was never my intention, right? So I basically construed this, but was reluctant to present it because I had no source for it. I said, if it's so simple, somebody had to have said it. Now, I should tell you now, a big rule in understanding Tanakh and understanding Parshanot HaMikra, biblical exegesis. Pretty much any correct interpretation, anything that you think is a correct interpretation of the text, somebody must have said it already. The problem is that not everything that was said was written down. Not everything that was written down was preserved. So it took me a while before I finally found where it was not only said, but written down and preserved. So here I found it in the commentary on the Akedah of a very significant medieval Parshan, Rabbi Levi ben Gershon Ralbag Gersonides of Provence, who says as follows, Nisa, hu me'inyan nisayon. Right? The word nisa et Avram surely is the nisa that comes from testing. Vinyan zen nisayon lefi da'ati, and what was the purpose of this test, in my opinion? Sheba'athu hanivu'ah bilashon misupak. That God deliberately communicated this prophecy to Avraham in a ambiguous way. What was the ambiguity? God said, Elav, right? Ha'alehu sham la'olah. V'zeh ha'ma'amar. These three words, Yitachen sheyuvan, can be understood as sheyizbach oto v'ya'aseh hu olah, to make Isaac the object of the sacrifice. Oh, however, alternatively, sheyale oto sham, take him up the mountain, lahalot olah, to show him how to do a korban. Why? Kedei sheyitchanech Yitzchak ba'avodat Hashem yitbarech. Because he had to take over from Abraham at some point in time. By the way, parenthetically, this is probably another indication that Yitzchak at this moment in time is 37. That Avram would let Yitzchak go to the age of 37 without showing him anything about how to serve God it just doesn't make sense. Okay. ועשה אותו השם יתברך, אם יקשה בעיניו לעשות שום דבר שיצווהו השם עליו, עד שיהיה זה סיבה אל שיבין מזה המאמר זולת מה שיובן ממנו בתחילת העניין. And God then arranged afterwards so that he should be in this quandary about which of the two interpretations was really intended. רצונו לומר שיובן ממנו שיעלה שם עולה אחרת, לא שיזבח בנו. God's intention was never to have Yitzchak be the object of the sacrifice, and eventually he clarified that to Abraham. So if indeed I'm right, and it was never God's intention for Yitzchak to be sacrificed, and for the 3 days that they went together to Har Moriah, it wasn't on Abraham's mind either, but rather it was a momentary thing. At the instant in which he thought that he should find a Sela Olah and he didn't find it, it was just in that moment. Then how did Akedat Yitzchak become this big thing about fathers taking the lives of their sons and taking the lives of their wives and ultimately committing martyrdom themselves? Where in the world did this all come from? So the answer is that it came from 1096. It comes from the First Crusade. And here we have it. In medieval Jewish Ashkenazic culture, 2 layers of new meaning were attached to the ancient narrative, reflecting historical and cultural aspects of Jewish existence in Christian Europe in the High Middle Ages. The first is theological. It's the reclaiming of the story of Akedat Yitzchak in reaction to the Christian appropriation of the story as a prefiguration of the crucifixion of Jesus. Okay. That, if you're into these things, is the Lamb of God. Okay. The second meaning in the next paragraph, second added meaning, comes from the time of the First Crusade, where the story became associated with the narrative of Kiddush Hashem, martyrdom. Okay. Chronicles of the Crusade, not the biblical book of Chronicles. Okay, Chronicles of the First Crusade and Kinot, right, Piyutim, that were written to mourn the congregations that in France and Germany that were destroyed during the First Crusade, relating the persecution of Jews by Christians during the Middle Ages in today's Germany and France, often mention Akedat Yitzchak and portray martyred Jews as a Yitzchak figure. Some of these texts even tell, in a manner that corresponds to the biblical narrative, how at the time, in 1096, some Jewish parents killed their own children in order to prevent them from being forced to convert to Christianity, thus viewing themselves as the Abraham figure. And research conducted by an expert, Shalom Siegel, he taught for decades in the Jewish Theological Seminary, revealed that an ancient version of the story, claiming that Isaac was in fact killed by Abraham and miraculously resurrected, circulated in medieval Ashkenazic Jewry. And it seems that the popularity of this version in the Middle Ages may be attributed to both of these aforementioned causes. And I give you the reference here to Shalom Siegel's book, The Last Trial, which is basically an extensive examination of this piyut, in which not only does Abraham kill Isaac, but God then brings Isaac back to life. And according to some versions of it, Abraham, when he sees Isaac come back to life, assumes that he did not correctly kill him. So he tries a second time, which, by the way, if you think about it exegetically, explains a curious thing in the Torah text. God says to Abraham, Al tishlach yadcha al hana'ar, right? Don't raise a hand. Then it says, Vayikra malach Hashem al Avraham shenit min hashamayim, that an angelic voice calls out to Abraham a second time. What do you need to call out to him a second time? So the Piyut answers by saying, because the first time, he thought he had killed Isaac, and then God brought Isaac back to life. So Avram thought, oops, I missed. He was going to try again. So you got to stop him. How do you explain the second time according to Pshat rather than Drash? Simple. Abraham, standing there holding the Ma'achelet, had to be hoping against hope that somehow he was mistaken and that somehow he would be stopped from what he was doing. So when God called out to him and said, stop, Abraham was suspected that wasn't really the voice of God, but rather it was his own conscience. And therefore he disregarded it. Therefore God had to call him a second time and say, no, Abraham, this is not wishful thinking. This is really the voice of God. And I end up here, just if you're interested, I brought a couple of examples of how Akedat Yitzchak became incorporated into Ashkenazic Machzorim and Haggadot in the High Middle Ages. And with that, I will take a quick look at the chat and see if there are questions. In the first Piyut ben Abbas, third stanza, how would you find out which midrash he uses? Sarah saying, as I said, if you look at the notes, there are 2.5 pages of notes there. If you look at the notes, you'll find the sources. Do we ever see a paitan? Yes, as I said, indeed that's what happens in any number, particularly in terms of the Akedat Yitzchak. Different paitanim assign different roles to Sarah. The most typical midrash asks the question, how did Sarah find out about it in the first place? I mean, if in the biblical text itself, Sarah isn't even mentioned, right? How did she find out? So instead of saying, well, of course, if Avram's going to take Yitzchak on a 3-day journey, of course he's going to tell Sarah we're going away for 3 days. I mean, you don't have to tell me that. It's obvious, right? But the Midrash says that Sarah was informed of the Akedah by the Satan. Right? Satan came, not obviously in a having assumed a human form, right? And told Sarah, so they told you they were going on a camping trip, huh? Ha ha, that's what you think. So as I said, yes, indeed, there are numerous opportunities for engaging in original interpretation. With that, thank you, and I look forward once again. Next week, I will be back on the Upper West Side. Won't be enjoying the aura of Flatbush, but we'll
I think you
plod
missed
on
another
all the
message
same.
in the chat.
Pardon?
There's another question in the chat.
Oh, of course, came from you. Doesn't Rashi have something to say about this? Yeah, it's a curious thing. You know that we still to this very day do not possess the pure commentary of Rashi as it first emerged from his pen or the pen of his private secretary, and numerous accretions and deletions have come to the commentary of Rashi on the Torah. So the fact is that inserted into the middle of Rashi's commentary on the story of the Akedah is a text that comes from a midrash, from an early midrash, Midrash Tanchuma. And in the Midrash Tanchuma, it says as follows, that when Avraham raises his hand with the Ma'achelet, God says, Ata yadati ki yirei Elohim ata. Now I know. Now, what does now I know mean? Now I know implies I know now, but a moment ago, I didn't know. Now, again, that's inconsistent with God's omniscience. So what does God mean to say, now I know? So the Midrash, apropos of dealing with that question, says as follows. It says, Avram, what are you doing? I never told you to bind Isaac and to offer him as a sacrifice. I said to you, ha'alehu. So where are you now? You're on the top of the mountain. So what do you need to do next? Horidehu, take him down. So that does appear in Rashi's commentary. Now, it could be that it was stricken from Rashi's commentary in later manuscripts because it was inconsistent with the new narrative of the Akedah that started in Rashi's old age with the crusade. Right? Crusade was in 1096. Rashi died in 1096. 1096. Rashi died in 1040, right. So so I'm saying it's 1040, no, 1105.
11:10?
1105, I think. It could say it's too late in Rashi's life. So that could be. Or it could be again, it's difficult to tell. But yes, indeed, there is a place, there is a text that appears in many, maybe even most, but not all editions of Rashi's commentary in the Akedah, in which this distinction between Ha'alehu as make him a korban, as opposed to Ha'alehu simply take him to the top of the mountain, it does indeed appear. Thank you for that reminder. And with that, once again, Shavua Tov, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Shalom.